Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these presents, greetings. On behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the world to the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the United States government. We'll also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in the community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you keep your own webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our discussion, we'll have a question and answer session, so if you have a question, just type it in the group chat and we'll go through them in the order received. Today's host will be the Krulak Center's new Russia SME, Mr. James Harvey. Mr. Harvey is a former U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel with over 10 years as a Foreign Areas Officer, focusing on former Soviet Union. He deployed to Kosovo in 2002 with the Military Intelligence Battalion in Würzburg, Germany, and to OIF with the 3rd Infantry Division in 2007-2008. He spent time at the U.S. embassies in Kiev and Moscow, as well as other Russian-related assignments such as presidential translator, Pentagon Joint Staff, and an analyst at the Russia Strategic Initiative in Stuttgart. Mr. Harvey has published articles on Eurasian military, geopolitical, and cultural issues through the Foreign Military Studies offices in Fort Leavenworth. And with that, Mr. Harvey, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all. Again, Dr. Dmitry Gorenburg joins us today. He is the Senior Research Scientist in the Strategy, Policy, Plans, and Programs Division of CNA, the Center for Naval Analyses, and also an associate at the Harvard University Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. He previously served as Executive Director of the American Association of the Advancement of Slavic Studies. He currently serves as editor of Problems of Post-Communism and was also editor of Russian Politics and Law from 2009 to 2016. His research interests include security issues in the former Soviet Union, Russian military reform, Russian foreign policy, and ethnic politics and identity. Dr. Gorenburg, welcome to the Brewcast.
Thanks for having me.
The topic of today's Brewcast is Russian military reconstitution. Dr. Gorenburg, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 took most by surprise. Most experts that follow Russian military and geopolitical events assess that Russia's troop buildup on the border of Ukraine was probably another snap exercise. Soon, however, it became clear to all that Russia intended to forcefully take at least part of Ukraine. Most experts expected this conflict to end rather quickly and in favor of Russia, but yet another surprise occurred when the conflict dragged on longer than expected. Western countries responded almost immediately with imposing various types of sanctions against Russia. Russia has since weathered the effects of international sanctions quite well since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, contrary to most expectations. So my first question to you, Dr. Gorenburg, what methods is Russia using to counter Western sanctions?
Yeah, sure. So one thing that I think we have to kind of separate is the military side versus the civilian side, because there's a lot of civilian goods that end up also being under sanctions. But just to kind of limit the discussion here, I'm going to talk about the military side, because I think that's probably of most interest here to this audience. So Russia has 3 principal strategies for countering sanctions, and 2 of them have been working pretty well. So the first, the one that hasn't worked that well, is just import substitution. In other words, figuring out domestic components or alternatives for weapons or systems and components that they previously depended on. And they haven't done that much in terms of finding domestic alternatives. They've been trying for 10 years, since 2014, to eliminate their dependence on certain kinds of critical components, primarily machine tools, precision machine tools that they imported from the West, and also electronics, such as semiconductors and chips and that sort of thing. And by and large, they have made a very marginal progress on that. So what they did as an alternative is two things. One, they set up channels for importing these Western components through countries that are not part of the sanctions regime. So this is primarily China, Hong Kong associated with that, Turkey, some Central Asian countries, some other Middle Eastern countries. But that basically the idea is that those countries import some of these controlled, components that are on export control lists, basically, and then re-export them illegally through shell companies and that sort of thing to Russia. So that has been the main enabler for Russia to continue to manufacture the weapons that it needs for the war. The second strategy that has worked is foreign cooperation. And this is basically working more directly with the countries that are not part of the let's call it the Western Alliance, or the countries that are opposed to the invasion, and either importing weapons or components from them directly, or finding other ways to work together on joint ventures and that sort of thing. And the major countries that are involved there in terms of direct importation of weapons are Iran and North Korea, in terms of Iran providing drones, and North Korea providing shells and ammunition, and also some missiles. And then China doesn't provide weapons directly, but does provide components that it manufactures. So those are the main kind of ways in which Russia has been able to continue to keep its war machine functioning despite the sanctions regime.
Would this extend beyond just the current conflict with Ukraine? Is this something such as microprocessors and machine tools? Are these things that Russia needs to figure out how to develop domestically long term?
Yes. The problem for them is that they've known that for, like I said, 10 years now, and they have made very limited progress in doing so. So one example I can give you is in terms of microprocessors. There are a couple of Russian designed microprocessors that were developed in the late 2010s, early 2020s. But while they were able to make the designs, they were not able to set up domestic manufacturing. So what they did was they outsourced that manufacturing to Taiwan, which is one of the world leader in manufacturing of microprocessors. But that was cut off, obviously, when the sanctions regime began. So they have these designs, but they don't have the domestic capability of manufacturing them. And I can describe very similar processes in terms of machine tools, where they can make machine tools, and they can't make machine tools that are of a high enough level of precision to make the most advanced weapons. So they can make certain less advanced designs. Some of the older designs they can continue to manufacture, because a lot of that is based on Soviet technology or that they already had, and but the newer, more modern weapons is where they have trouble.
So on that point, does Russia have they've got the industrial capability for the weaponry you just mentioned. Are they going to be able to develop their military industrial capacity to produce the sorts of munitions and equipment they need, not only to prolong this conflict, but to get into its actual advanced weaponry stage beyond the war?
Well, I mean, there's variation here, right? There are some areas of advanced weaponry that they've been developing domestically for many years and can continue to do so. Like if we look at nuclear submarines, for example, right? That's a very advanced technology that very few countries are able to produce, and Russia is probably still at this point number two. I think they're still better than China on producing nuclear submarines, right? So they've been certain kinds of missiles as well, air defense. There's been an area of strength. You know, how it compares to the U.S. You know, I'm not enough of a weapons expert to know, and you know, which is, you know, is it marginally worse, marginally better? But they're in the same ballpark, let's say, as certain kinds of American weapons. So it's not a question of can they produce the advanced weapons or not. It's can they produce everything they need and at a sufficient scale.
Right.
That's the real question. So we know, for example, that they've had for a number of years now pretty advanced tank designs of the Armata tank, but they have not been able to build more than a few of these at a time at a very high price. And they've just, by and large, for this war, given the numbers that they need of armor and the losses that they face in Ukraine, so therefore the replacements that are needed, that's just not sustainable. So they've gone back to you know, refurbishing old tanks and you kind of using the Soviet design. So it's this kind of, it's a little more nuanced that will they be able to do it or not. It's yes, they I mean, the Russian defense industry is one of the most advanced, you know, leading in the defense industries in the world, but they're now in a fairly stressed environment where they're having to produce much more than they ever had to before, at least in the post-Soviet period. And so that is the question. And can they make precision guided missiles, right, without Western microprocessors? So far, the answer is no, but they can continue. They've found ways to continue to import through these parallel imports and that sort of thing, these Western microprocessors. So they can, so for the moment, they're continuing to do it. Whether they will be able to do it entirely domestically in, say, the next 5 years, I would guess the answer is more likely to be no than yes.
Do you see Russia, since we're talking about high-tech weaponry, do you see them closing the gap, the technological gap with the West? Domestically, it's going to be very difficult, as you just said. They're going to have to rely on other countries. Or have we, as the West, reached a point where Russia's at a point where they can never really catch up with high-tech things such as electronic warfare, UAVs, precision-guided missiles?
Yeah, so my sense is that the one thing that the sanctions is likely to lead to is a growing technological gap, right? It's not that Russia is going to stop being able to advance technologically. It's that being isolated from the rest of the world in terms of technological innovation is going to mean that they innovate more slowly than the rest of the world. And so that as everyone's going to innovate, but the rest of the world's going to innovate faster, just because of sharing of knowledge and that sort of thing.
Right.
And so in that way, I think that there will be a growing gap. Again, that's kind of a general statement. There are some areas where, you know, the gaps might not grow so fast, or they might shrink. Like you mentioned UAVs. I think that's a very interesting area where Russia has made a lot of advances in the last, 5 years or so, and in some ways, I mean, and there's here we have two components, right? There's the technological advances, but there's also the tactical, right? How you use the UAVs, and here the war is leading to very rapid innovation, not just for Russians, but even more so maybe for Ukrainians. But nonetheless, by using the UAVs in wartime, there's a huge amount of tactical innovation happening. I'm not particularly an expert on that. One of my colleagues, Sam Bendit, is really the expert on that topic. But that is an area that where Russia's has, if anything, has narrowed the gap to from where they didn't really have decent UAVs 5 years ago to now having fairly strong capability.
They did not prior to the war. And at the beginning, Ukrainians definitely had the advantage for UAV operations. But like you said, though, Russia has developed some UAV capabilities since the war started. Outside of tech, has that simply been a method of ramping up factory production of UAVs or throwing more domestic dollars at it?
I think it's a combination of things. So they do have, I mean, one of the main ways they've innovated there is they've improved there is through licensed production of Iranian drones, right? First importing them and then building a factory in Tatarstan that manufactures them basically under Iranian license. So that is one component of it. Another component is, I think, that they have really, when they do focus on something and they do invest significant resources in it, they can make progress. And one of the things about UAV is that they're not as high tech at this point as maybe microprocessors or something like that, right? A lot of the UAVs that are being used are really kind of use a lot of off-the-shelf components. There's a whole sort of the small UAV ecosystem in particular is there's a lot of sort of volunteers building these things out and so forth. So it's not as that sort of high-end technological innovation is not as needed at this point as for something else like hypersonic missiles or that sort of thing.
You mentioned the year 2014 as being kind of a trigger for Russia developing or advancing some of their systems. Did that come from Russia's taking back Crimea in 2014, or were some other things playing factors, like the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in 2020 was a good example of how UAVs can be the so-called poor man's air force?
Yeah, so I think there was a combination of factors. If we go back to the Serdyukov reform period, right? So 2009 to 2012, 2013, there was a very kind of conscious effort to borrow from the West, both in terms of how the military was organized, but also technology. And that was the time when there were various deals for military equipment with France in particular, but Germany as well. I mean, the Mistral ships was the most sort of publicly visible example of that kind of defense industrial cooperation, where there were, France was going to build for 2 ships for Russia in France, but then they were going to build 2 more in Russia and help them develop the capabilities to build these kinds of ships domestically, right? That, was obviously canceled then in 2014. But there were other deals. There were night vision equipment deals. There were, Germany was, I think, building a training center for the Russian military, if I remember correctly. So various other things like that. And of course, German engines were going into Russian ships as well. The attack, the annexation of Crimea and the attack on eastern Ukraine led to the first round of sanctions, which then led to a reevaluation within Russian sort of corridors of power on the dangers of dependence on the West for this kind of technology. I mean, there was a whole separate issue where they had a lot of defense industrial links with Ukraine that were then not severed yet. They weren't severed until 2022, but they were significantly reduced by the, mostly by the Ukrainians, obviously. And so that led, together with kind of a different attitude in general towards the West, when the replacement of Serdukov by Shoigu as defense minister, and kind of just a general reorientation towards greater confrontation with the West, with Putin's return to the presidency and a whole host of things, led to a much greater emphasis on kind of defense industrial independence, let's call it. So that was kind of the start of that process. And like I said, import substitution, they made some progress, but not as much as they, I think, were looking for during that period between 2014 and 2022. So, and the one thing that, if you have a system that is 30% foreign components and you decide you need to make it domestically, and you decrease that dependence so that it's only 10% foreign components, you're still dependent on those foreign components if further sanctions are implemented. So that like marginal improvement is insufficient until you get to 100%. If the sanctions regime is strict enough and you actually can't get those remaining, whatever it is, 1% even of components, you're not going to be able to build that system until you get to 100%.
And is that assumed to be Russia's goal, to be 100% domestic, so they're not lacking things like machine tools, microprocessors?
Yes. I hesitate a little bit because I think they are, at the moment at least, they recognize that that's not necessarily achievable. So they're willing to cooperate with countries that are not, that they know are not going to be part of the Western coalition. So China, for example. But there's still, I think, down the road, like, the first priority is to replace the Western components. Down the road, I think they'd prefer to not be dependent on anyone, because you never know if China might have some other interests, or China might decide that their economic relations with Europe are more important than Russia, or something like that. So they don't want to be beholden on that level. And this is a broader, it's a broader kind of policy direction or strategy for Russia. So there's been a lot of discussion on, when we get far outside of the military sphere, food security, right? They made a very conscious decision under Putin, relatively early on under Putin, to try to reduce their dependence on foreign imports for key food supplies. Maybe not the luxury goods, but that doesn't matter that much. But grain, that sort of thing, like the key things that they're dependent on, dairy products, and they've kind of followed that strategy to really make themselves secure in that sphere. And I think they would like to apply that kind of mentality to the military. It's proving a little more difficult, I think, with the military.
In order to do that, in order to get to 100% domestic production, it seems like they would have to draw sectors of their economy funding for other sectors such as healthcare, pensions, education, what have you. It seems like the money would have to come from somewhere. Any guesses on where they draw from and how that impacts the average Russian?
Well, I mean, we've seen, it's hard to know details, but because they don't publish a lot of kind of, this disaggregated economic statistics. But if you look at the big budget picture, we see the 2024 budget being much more oriented toward kind of a war economy and a lot of other kinds of kind of civilian consumer maybe oriented or civilian infrastructure projects getting less funding. Now, what that means specifically, like which projects get canceled or postponed or just never designed, that's hard to know. At least, I mean, there are probably people who are, I'm not an economist and I don't, it's not my area of focus. So I imagine there are people out there who have at least more information than I do. But we do see that at the aggregate level, the security and defense now reaching kind of unprecedented levels of 30-40% of budget expenditures, and that will undoubtedly have impacts on the civilian population. Exactly what those are, I'm not sure I can tell you.
For the West, for Western countries that have already got sanctions against Russia, as you've described, they found multiple ways around those sanctions. For the West, is it really just as simple as clamping down on these third countries that are getting high-tech military components into Russia?
I mean, yes and no, right? That would have a big effect, but it's not simple, right? Because there are so the organizations and companies that have sprung up to work around these sanctions are pretty good at it. They know how to kind of either go, be underground or create shell companies and that sort of thing. So it's hard to trace. And unless you want to place secondary sanctions on entire countries, some of whom are our treaty allies, right? If you're talking about the United States, then you have to follow kind of the legal processes of figuring out which specific companies are violating the sanctions, and then going after those companies, and they are often a couple of steps ahead of you, and shifting and creating new organizations and that sort of thing. So I mean, that would, if we were able to cut off those supplies, that would help a lot in terms of making Russian defense industry much less able to resupply the war effort in Ukraine or against Ukraine. But it's not so easy to do that. I think, the U.S. government, from what I understand, is, trying, doing quite a bit to do just that. But it's not. It's it's a difficult process from a legal perspective.
Targeting individual persons or business entities is not an efficient way to go about it. One of the themes you've discussed so far is Russia's reliance on other countries for high tech. Any guess as to whether Russia would be willing to express its lessons learned with the conflict in Ukraine with other countries such as China, if that means it can continue to benefit from receiving the tech weaponry it needs to sustain this war?
Yeah, this is we don't really know, to be honest. That I mean, maybe at least in the open source. I mean, maybe the Intel community has some information on what exactly the Russians have been willing to share with these partners that are supplying them with weapons. We're pretty confident that they're not doing it out of that Iran and North Korea are getting something out of this.
Right.
Probably beyond just funding. What specifically that is very hard to know, and there hasn't been public information about that. We know that, at least from what I'm talking to my colleagues that study China, that the Chinese are closely following the war and drawing lessons in terms of for their operations and their doctrine and so forth. How much of that is coming from things that are being shared directly by the Russians versus just what they're observing, I don't really know.
Okay. At this point, I would like to pass it off to Major Janikin, who's got a question for you, Doctor.
Sure.
Yes, sir. My question, recently I saw a small article about Russian readiness, and I was wondering if you were able to speak on how they view readiness as opposed to how a Western state might view readiness, and this is mostly for military readiness.
Sure, but do you mean both in terms of equipment and personnel, or?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is not something I've studied directly myself. Some of my colleagues have. So there is. I think there's maybe less emphasis on the Russian side on rotation than there might be a regular rotation than there might be in the Western side. They, in part because certainly in the early stages of this war, they were having a pretty serious manpower problem until they started the partial mobilization effort in the fall of 22. And so there was a lack of personnel to bring in and rotate. And so that, obviously, if you're in in the fight for an indefinite period of time, that's gonna degrade, and people with taking casualties and losing equipment and all, and just the morale aspects of that as well, that's going to degrade readiness. And I think they were willing. One thing that we've seen both in the past, like historically, this has been kind of the stereotype of the Russian military, but I think it's to some extent been proven true again in this war, is that they have a much lower aversion to casualties than at least the U.S. military does. And so they are there is and I sort of hesitate a bit because it is a bit of a stereotype, but it's just like what we've seen so far seems to prove it true, is that they do view some of the sort of the kind of the grunts, the lower ranked soldiers as somewhat expendable, both in terms of just leaving them on the front lines, and also just how they're supplied and the equipment that they have and that sort of thing, and the kinds of tactics that they use in trying to take territory, and that kind of these mass assaults where they know they're going to take pretty high casualties. So that aspect of it, I think, is fairly different. They also, this may be a little bit more speculative, but in terms of equipment, I think that they are kind of used to a higher level of non-functional or dysfunctional equipment, and they kind of that's sort of accepted as part. If you're going to start moving out a brigade or a regiment or something like that, some of the equipment is not going to work, and either you have mechanics that can fix it quickly, or you just abandon some of it, and that's just kind of people are kind of accepting of that, and they're used to it. So there's a little bit of that kind of thing. I don't know if that kind of gets at what you were asking about.
I think that covers it. The article also talked about how a lot of their equipment is, even older equipment. They'll train on older equipment, and then the theory being that they would jump into something newer when they had to go to combat. And what that meant was, though, is that newer equipment still had a lot of the old, how the tank, I'm going to call it a cockpit, but that's my aviation speak. The inside of the tank is similar in a new tank. And I wonder if, we saw the video of the Bradley crushing a T-90. Is that because they're still using this older setup? It brought up some interesting questions, but how we view readiness in the U.S. military, I feel like is very different.
Yeah. I guess I haven't really looked at that specific aspect of training, what kind of equipment they train on versus what they use. So so I don't know if I can speak to that specifically. There's just a lot more old equipment than new equipment, right? Like, I mean, T-90 is one thing, but like Armata is maybe the difference, right? Like T-90 is still like a modernized version of a Soviet design. So that's where, like, when you're talking about, it's all kind of one big family, and they kind of modified at the margins, whereas the Armata was a completely new design with different features. So I'm not sure that would apply to the Armata, but then at the same time, there are very few Armadas, so it may not be that relevant in this case.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mr. Harvey, back over to you, sir.
Yep, thank you. And that's a trend, as you stated earlier, that Russia very often chooses to refurbish and modernize existing platforms like tank and armored vehicles, as opposed to designing, developing, and fielding new systems. Are they still set on the traditional combat platforms and winning? I say that with quotes, almost winning the conflict in Ukraine. Are they still really looking at artillery, armored vehicles, tanks? Or has the recent UAV success that Russia has had maybe convinced them that, okay, maybe in this conflict, invest more in UAVs, electronic warfare, jamming, and anything else high tech that can combat additional NATO weaponry that might show up on the ground?
Well, I think that the thing about the Russian kind of way of war is they had their initial thought, right, when they began this war against Ukraine, they had this idea they would fight differently, right? That went very wrong, right? They had this, they were sort of, they had ideas that were based on their vision of how they thought the U.S. carried out these regime change operations in different places, how the U.S. fought. So they were going to come into Ukraine, do a decapitation strike, right? the Eastern Ukrainian kind of Russian speakers would greet them as liberators and all the rest, right? That didn't work. So then they reverted to the traditional way of fighting, right? That's in their doctrine and so forth, which is very, as you describe, artillery heavy, kind of, big, kind of attrition warfare focused.
Mhm.
And I would say that they are still what they've done in the last few months, and I think this is also very much part of the doctrine, is supplement that with technology rather than replace.
Mhm.
So what we see is UAVs. UAVs are not replacing artillery; they're making targeting better, right? Like, you're still using the artillery, but now you're sending out the UAVs so you have a better sense of exactly where to hit, so you're more efficient. Right? You're using UAVs to kind of ferret out where there are weaknesses in the Ukrainian lines. Right? There was an article about this, I think, just this morning in New York Times. And then, concentrate your attack there. So, I mean, reconnaissance has always been a part of warfare, but now you're using that technology to improve it, right? Rather than it being a completely new, it's not, predator drone warfare, right? This is not like the way the U.S. started using, uh, UAVs in the things that we were doing in the in the Middle East. This is complementing what their existing tactics and their existing doctrine. And the electronic warfare is similar. I mean, electronic warfare has always been a major focus for the Russian military. Now you have, compared to the past, now you have, okay, now we're going to jam GPS or whatever it is. So again, it's complementing the but there haven't what we're not seeing by and large is large scale maneuver warfare, whether that's because that's not how they haven't trained that well enough, or because they lost some of their best, most capable units early in the war, and those were the only ones who were capable of doing that. Not necessarily clear, but we do know, we know what we see, which is that they're doing mostly small scale infantry assaults backed with some of these other things.
Is any of the techniques they're using in Ukraine, target identification, coordinating fires, is that a result of their operations in Syria?
I you know I mean, maybe target identification to some extent. It's a very different kind of fight, right? Syria for Russia
Mhm.
was primarily an air campaign. There was the ground component there was Syrian, Iranian, Hezbollah. The Russian military they had some involvement. PMCs had a little more, Wagner and so forth.
Right.
But regular ground units, the Russian military were not involved by and large. And so uh, it, it wasn't really a frontal warfare kind of fight, right? It was
Mhm.
more of like these
Force on
kind of
force.
targeting and so the air campaign. The flip side is that in Ukraine, because they were never able to achieve air superiority, which of course they had in Syria, at least the parts of Syria that they were focused on, um, Russian Air Force was it's not that it was largely absent. It wasn't absent, but it was used cautiously and didn't really, go and fly out all over Ukraine. Right? They would stay. what they've been doing is kind of standoff strikes with long-range weapons or glide bombs or that sort of thing. So that's a very different, tactically, again, that's not applying Syrian lessons. That's sort of adapting to the conditions that they're finding themselves in.
Dr. Gorenburg, I'm now going to go to the chat. Some more amateur observers have been predicting the exhaustion of its various tracked vehicle fleets as the war continues. In a hypothetical situation where they do run out of tanks, tracked infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers, and become more reliant on wheeled vehicles. Okay.
Yeah. Would it affect the ability of Ukrainian troops to defeat pushes and attack?
Would it necessarily affect the ability of Ukrainian troops to defeat offensives and counterattack?
Right.
So I think he's asking if they are depleted of typical armored vehicles, tanks, would it be sufficient to conduct their ops on wheeled vehicles?
Yeah. So, I mean, the short answer is it would be much more difficult because you're ending up, you're in an area where there aren't necessarily roads everywhere, right? So the flip side is that they're not doing a lot of armored pushes, right? Like I said, it's a lot of infantry, artillery, kind of softening positions, right? And then infantry comes in. So tanks play in that sense, unlike in maybe more larger scale maneuver warfare, tanks are playing more of a supporting role for that. So I think that would it be more difficult for them? Yes, I think it would. Is it a game changer? I'm not sure. Given, I mean, we haven't really talked about the kind of the overall situation, but I see both sides at this point in a place where they are making, the potential for small scale advances is there on, right now on the Russian side, but down the road potentially again on the Ukrainian side. But it seems difficult. It seems to me that it's difficult just looking at the frontline fight to see big breakthroughs in the current environment. Now things could change, right? And one of the things that the Russians are trying to do is to destroy or weaken a lot of the Ukrainian infrastructure to make those, they don't have energy and that sort of thing. That makes it more possible. But that's kind of the bigger fight. If we're talking about just like the what's going on the front line, I think these kinds of things are limited.
We have another question. I believe this is coming from Manny. So not necessarily reconstitution, but touches on a topic you just raised up, PMCs. Mm-hmm. Manny says, hi, could Russia be looking to hire more paramilitaries from countries that it's close with, such as North Korea, after Putin having a meeting there? Or after the Wagner mutiny, will that likely not happen?
I'm not sure it's necessary. I think it is relatively unlikely, but I'm not sure I would tie it to the Wagner mutiny directly. I just, because, there are a lot of just logistical issues with bringing in foreign military to fight for you, right? North Korean, like if you bring in some North Korean soldiers, are they reporting to North Korean commanders? Are they reporting to Russian commanders? If so, do they speak Russian? What's all those kinds of cohesiveness questions really come out to the forefront. And at the moment, Russia does not have that much of a shortage of manpower. I mean, I'm sure they'd love to have more soldiers, and their recruitment is a little bit slowing down, but over the last year, they've done pretty well in terms of just bringing in the Russian soldiers. So I'm not sure there's a strong need for foreign fighters at the moment. Maybe I can see them, hiring paramilitary type people for, adventures in Africa or somewhere far away, right? But then again, it probably wouldn't be North Koreans. It might be Russian speakers from somewhere else in the FSU or something like that.
Right. So this reminds me of the initial stage of Russian-Chinese military cooperation, where it really wasn't what we in the West would consider cooperation, full engagement. Speaking of personnel, Dr. Gorenburg, I believe in January 2023, former Defense Minister Shoigu stated that Russia intended to raise its ranks from 1.35 million to 1.5. And is that realistic, or are they making gains over the past year plus in reaching that 1.5?
I don't believe so. I mean, they were having a hard enough time reaching 1 million before the war, right? I mean, there were staffing shortfalls, and could they do it if the war ended? Possibly, but the problem is that they're taking casualties. They're having to rotate people out. I think, and then if the war were to end, and they ended the kind of the stop loss aspects, there'd be a lot of people who would feel like they'd had enough and would finish out their contracts. So I think it's they've been working on increasing their number of contract soldiers for many years now, and they have increased them, but they've never quite been able to reach the targets that they set themselves, which is why they were always having there weren't huge shortfalls, but 10% maybe, something like that at various points, maybe a little higher. So I think that that's still where they're at now. And right now they're more focused on kind of replacing losses and doing rotations as best they can, rather than the aspirational larger military for down the road.
Thank you. It looks like Albert Lee has resubmitted his initial question. Albert says, what tech development priorities were chosen so that the Russian military industrial complex can develop new aircraft, drones, electronic warfare equipment, but not solve the problems their tank designers were already facing in the late 1980s?
So, yeah, I think that this is where, like I said, there's you have to kind of disaggregate, as I think this question has done, disaggregate the Russian defense industry. There are parts of Russian defense industry that are adapted more readily to the kind of post-Cold War period and were modernized and so forth, and other parts that weren't. And part of that had to do with priorities and who had funding and so forth. I mean, even like you look within the area I'm probably most familiar with is shipbuilding, just because I work for a Navy-oriented think tank, and you can see this divergence in the Soviet Navy was building at a fairly rapid clip large numbers of submarines, large numbers of surface ships, fairly big surface ships, right? Like they had a version of an aircraft carrier, they had big cruisers and that sort of thing. In the 90s and the early 2000s, they continued to build submarines, including and design new submarines, and they basically dropped. They decided that was a priority. They couldn't really afford everything, so they stopped building large ships. And now, 35 years later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we see that they are, building pretty advanced nuclear submarines, both SSBNs and SSGNs, right? The Yasin, the Bore class and the Yasin class. And they haven't been able to build a ship larger than a frigate since the 1990s, and have no obvious plans to do so in the foreseeable future, even as their existing large ships kind of more and more reach the end of their lifespan, or as in the case of the Moscow, are sunk. So
what is the reason for that? For them not having long-term plans for development?
For the Navy, for the civil ships,
right?
Well, I mean, given what they want to do with their Navy at the moment, it's not hugely necessary. I think they prioritize correctly as far as they're concerned. For given limited resources, they're much more focused on protecting the homeland, and you can do that with corvettes and frigates, plus nuclear submarines can provide. Well, then they provide a number of, I mean, obviously the SSBNs are there for deterrence, but then the Yasins can protect them together with the smaller surface ships in the bastions, which you don't have to go out very far. Plus then you have the Yasins that can go out and do the traditional attack submarine kind of missions of holding U.S. aircraft carrier groups at risk and that sort of thing. But in terms of why they like, I think at some point they thought, when they had lots of resources and before the war, they thought there were certainly advocates for the Navy who wanted to build large ships. But now you've had 30 odd years, 25, 30 years at that point of atrophy, and so you've lost skills. You've lost, the shipyards don't really know how to do that. So to get back to the larger question of that Albert asked, so there are some parts of defense industry, particularly ones where the exports were going well, where they maintained capabilities and were able to ramp back up when the funding kicked back in the last 15 years. Whereas where they hadn't done much of anything, or where the supply chains were much more based on cooperation with other former Soviet countries that were no longer providing, whatever the components were, that was much more difficult. And so, and because of, and now to get back to the tank question, right? They had huge numbers of tanks left over from the Soviet Union. I mean, they're still using up those stockpiles now, right? After 3 years of war. And so there didn't seem to be much of a need for new tanks. Like who wanted to buy new tanks in the 1990s and 2000s in Russia, right? And so a lot of that, they weren't really providing new designs, so a lot of that was lost, and it took time to rebuild it, which is why when we saw the money coming back in the early 2010s, they were like, right, we have designs for, they weren't necessarily all implemented, but we have designs for new generation aircraft, we have designs for new generation missiles, both precision guided attack missiles and air defense, right? S-400s, that sort of thing. But they spent the first 5 years, of that state armaments program, the 2021, so 2010 to 2015. They spent that just like trying to get the design bureaus to create designs for the new tanks and armored vehicles and tracked and wheeled and all the rest, right? Before they could even start test production. And then they never were really, on some of them they did, but a lot of them they never really got to serial production before the war began, and so priorities changed.
There's a question in the chat I think this will be the last one I get to, is from Eric Nyen. I have not heard of this, but perhaps you have. He's got a question about whether or not Russia has any sort of electric vehicles.
I'm afraid I don't know.
Seeks to develop.
I don't know that level of detail.
I haven't heard of that either, but I think I have one last question. And Russia used to be a significant exporter of military equipment, air defense systems, and so on. Has that changed drastically since 2022? Is it seeking to limit that completely because it needs what it has on the battlefield in Ukraine?
It certainly has. I don't know, completely is strong, right? So there are certain types of weapons that they've certainly cut back, and there have been complaints. Trying to remember, I think it was India, if I remember correctly, but there are probably other countries as well that have complained about contracts not being fulfilled or being delayed and that sort of thing, because they've rerouted missiles in particular to the war effort. They still need the revenue for that they get from arms sales, and and so I don't think it's going to be completely rerouted. And there's certain areas where it's not as much, like if you look at aircraft, right? They're not losing. I mean, they're losing some aircraft, but it's not as catastrophic as in ground equipment. So there, I think, and that's where some of their more saleable equipment is anyway, right? They're not selling for the reasons we just discussed. They didn't have the best. I mean, maybe the old tanks, right? Like those they probably, if there were still contracts, I haven't tracked it in particular. There probably were some contracts for various older models of tanks. I imagine those are have been rerouted. Although I do think that India was building some under license, so that could continue, right? If it's a production is in India, that's fine. I don't know if that's still continuing or not, but they had some of those contracts some years ago. But again, aircraft, things like that, I think they could continue to sell. I think I've seen that there are delays in fulfilling contracts for things like S-400s.
S-400s, right.
As well as 300s and S-400s. Yeah.
Dr. Gorenburg, I think we're just about coming up on our time for this session of Brewcast. But unless you have any other points you would like to make, I thank you very much for your time today, as well as all of those in attendance.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much for coming on again. And Major Janikin, over to you.
Again, Dr. Gorenburg, thank you very much for coming. Also, thank you to the folks who joined us today in the chat, and to those that are going to join us in the future on YouTube and Spotify. That's all we have for this episode, so go ahead and carry out the plan of the day. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.